Welcome everyone to a deep dive. Today we're looking at, well, the biggest picture possible, the story of us, of Homo sapiens.
Yeah, we've gathered some sources that really try to zoom out and make sense of the whole grand narrative.
They offer this unique perspective on why we are the way we are, how our societies function, that kind of thing.
Right. The goal is to pull out some really fascinating insights, understand the deep roots of our present.
Exactly. Think of this as getting you seriously well informed on the huge sweep of human history. We want to unpack the key moments, the big ideas.
Understand the why behind the major shifts. Connect the dots across vast stretches of time.
And hopefully give you those aha moments, without completely drowning you in detail.
It's about making sense of the journey.
Okay, let's dive in. Maybe starting where the sources really emphasize a dramatic shift, our sudden, almost overnight jump to the top of the food chain.
Yeah, that's a really striking point. I mean, think about other top predators, lions, sharks.
They took millions of years to get there.
Exactly. Evolving slowly, step by step.
Yeah.
And that gave the whole ecosystem time to, you know, adjust, find a new balance. Pro-developed defenses, other predators adapted.
It was gradual, integrated.
But with sapiens, the sources argue it was explosive, like incredibly sudden in evolutionary terms.
We went from the middle somewhere, scavenging, being hunted sometimes, to dominating the entire planet almost instantly.
And this speed, this suddenness, had massive consequences, not just for the planet, but for us, psychologically.
Right, the ecosystems didn't have time to adjust, obviously, but the sources say we didn't either. Internally.
That's the really crucial insight here. Think about it. For countless generations, our ancestors lived with this deep-seated fear, anxiety, always watching out for danger.
The mindset of something vulnerable.
Precisely. And then, boom, suddenly we're on top, wielding incredible power. But the sources suggest we carried those old fears, that old vulnerability, into our new role.
So we've got all this power, but we're still running on the old software, so to speak. The fear, the anxiety.
That's the picture they paint. This mismatch, immense power, combined with this lingering sense of insecurity from our past, and they link this directly to making us doubly cruel and dangerous.
Doubly cruel. How so?
Well, not just cruel out of necessity, like a predator needing to eat, but potentially cruel out of that underlying fear and anxiety, lashing out perhaps from a place we hadn't quite evolved beyond.
Wow. That puts a really different spin on our species' early success. It's unsettling.
It is. And the sources connect this fundamental unease, this rapid, maybe unnerving ascent to some of the major catastrophes throughout history.
Like deadly wars, ecological disasters.
Yeah. The argument is that this inherent instability, this power, coupled with unresolved fear, might be an underlying factor in why we've seen such destructive patterns repeat. It's a powerful, maybe a bit dark framing.
It definitely challenges the heroic narrative. So, okay, let's step back even further. Before this explosion, before agriculture, cities, all that, what was life really like for hunter-gatherers? The common image is pretty simple, maybe a bit cartoonish.
Yeah, the sources paint a much more complex and frankly impressive picture. It wasn't just cavemen chasing mammoths all day.
Right.
Their diet was incredibly diverse. The sources call it elastic and opportunistic.
Meaning they ate pretty much anything available.
Pretty much. Termites, berries, roots, nuts, catching rabbits, fish, and yes, occasionally hunting bigger game like mammoths when the opportunity arose.
Yeah.
But gathering was key.
Gathering provided most of the calories.
Yes, and its essential raw materials, wood, flint for tools, fibers. It was the foundation.
And surviving like that required just an incredible amount of knowledge, didn't it? More than we can probably imagine today.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Vastly more. They needed these detailed mental maps of huge territories, sometimes hundreds of square kilometers.
Knowing every path, every water source.
Exactly. Plus, intimate knowledge of plants, which ones were edible, when they ripened, how to process them to make them safe or nutritious. They knew animal behavior inside out, tracking, habits, migration patterns.
And not just food. Which plants were poisonous? Which had medicinal uses? How to read the weather, predict storms, recognize signs of drought.
And the practical skills. The sources mention things like napping flint into a perfect spearhead in minutes, patching clothes with bone needles, setting ingenious traps.
Knowing what to do if you run into a lion or get bitten by a snake or caught in an avalanche. Skills most of us today. Well, we wouldn't last a day.
It's a level of mastery of their immediate environment that's hard for us to grasp. It took years, decades of learning, passed down generationally.
And this leads to a really interesting, almost provocative argument in the sources.
Yeah, the idea that in some ways hunter-gatherers might have had a more comfortable, maybe even more satisfying life than many people later on. Farmers, factory workers, even us in our offices today.
That feels totally backwards to how we usually think about progress. Easier lives.
Like, that's the evidence for that.
Well, they point to studies of recent hunter-gatherer groups, like those in the Kalahari Desert, people living in pretty harsh environments.
And these studies suggest they spent, on average, maybe 35 to 45 hours a week actively getting food and resources.
That's less than a standard modern work week for many.
Right. They might hunt only 1 day in 3. Gathering might take 3 to 6 hours a day. The work was likely more varied, too. Not the same repetitive motion day after day.
And the domestic side.
Ah, yes. That's where the comparison gets maybe a little pointed for modern listeners.
No dishes, no vacuuming.
Exactly. No polishing floors, no changing diapers constantly, no bills to pay. The sources lay it out quite plainly. It paints a picture of potentially more leisure time and fewer tedious chores.
It really challenges that linear view of history as always getting better for the average person. Better how?
Materially, maybe. But in terms of satisfaction, leisure, connection, it makes you question things.
But it's crucial. The sources don't just romanticize this, right? They acknowledge a potential dark side.
Absolutely vital.
Mm-hmm.
We have to avoid the noble savage stereotype. These were fully complex humans, capable of cooperation, yes, but also cruelty, violence, difficult choices.
They use the example of the Ache people in Paraguay. Some of the ethnographic accounts are tough.
They are, mentioning things like documented instances of infanticide under certain circumstances, or abandoning the old or very sick who couldn't keep up.
Like that story of the man nicknamed Vulture Droppings who was left behind sick but then recovered.
Yes, a stark reminder of the harsh realities they faced. It underscores the point. Don't idealize, don't demonize. They were people navigating a difficult world, making choices we might find shocking today.
They were complex, not angels, not monsters, just human.
Exactly. And trying to understand their world, even their inner world, is tricky.
Like interpreting cave art. Lascaux.
Right. Those amazing paintings, 15,000, 20,000 years old. One interpretation mentioned is that image of a bird-headed figure may be killed by a bison. Could it represent the soul leaving the body?
A glimpse into ancient spirituality?
Possibly. But the sources caution us we lack the cultural context. Our interpretations might say more about us than about them. It's like a prehistoric Rorschach test.
A good warning. But something we can be more certain about is the impact of what the sources call the cognitive revolution, this leap in thinking, in consciousness.
This seems to be the point where sapiens really developed the tools, cognitive tools, language for truly large-scale, ambitious projects.
And one of the most stunning early examples is colonizing Australia.
Okay.
Around 45,000 years ago.
Yeah, think about that. It wasn't just walking across a land bridge. It meant crossing serious stretches of open ocean, maybe 100 kilometers or more in places.
How on earth did they do that back then?
The most likely idea presented is that groups in the Indonesian archipelago developed real maritime skills. They weren't just paddling rafts across rivers. They were building seaworthy boats, navigating, becoming deep-sea fishers and explorers. A massive leap.
Incredible. And this cooperation wasn't just for practical things like migration. We see it for seemingly cultural or religious reasons, too, even before farming.
Göbekli Tepe. That site is just mind-blowing. These huge carved stone pillars built by hunter-gatherers, maybe 12,000 years ago or even earlier.
Requiring thousands of people from different bands working together over long periods.
Exactly. And not for shelter, not for storing food. The purpose seems purely ceremonial, ritualistic, mysterious. It shows that shared beliefs, shared myths, could mobilize enormous collective effort long before agriculture.
Which brings us right to one of the absolute core ideas in these sources.
Yeah.
The phenomenal power of shared fictions, enabled by our unique kind of language.
Okay, let's really get into this because lots of animals communicate, right? Bees do their waggle dance for food locations.
Vervet monkeys have different calls for eagles versus lions.
Whales sing complex songs. Elephants communicate over distances. Parrots mimic us. So communication itself isn't unique.
So what is the unique thing about human language?
Here's the mind bender. The sources argue its real power isn't just describing reality, there's a lion or there's fruit over there. It's the ability to talk about things that don't exist in the physical world.
Things that aren't real, like myths, stories.
Yeah. Exactly. Myths, legends, gods, spirits, but also, crucially, things like nations, states, money, corporations, human rights, laws, justice.
Wait, those aren't real.
Not in the sense that a tree or a rock is real. They don't exist physically, objectively. They exist only because we collectively believe they exist. They exist in our shared imagination, in the stories we tell and agree to live by.
And that's what allows large-scale cooperation between strangers, believing the same story.
Precisely. The sources make this stark comparison with chimpanzees. 1-on-1, or maybe 10-on-10, humans and chimps aren't that different socially. Similar dynamics, hierarchies based on personal relationships.
Okay.
But get beyond about 150 individuals, Dunbar's number, roughly the limit for stable relationships based on personal knowing, and the difference explodes. Compare thousands of chimps versus thousands of humans.
Right, the thought experiment. Dump thousands of chimps onto Wall Street or into the Vatican.
Pure chaos and
But
pandemonium. Because they can't coordinate beyond their immediate social bonds and hierarchy.
put thousands of humans there.
You get complex patterns. Trade networks humming on Wall Street, elaborate religious ceremonies at the Vatican, political negotiations at the UN, mass protests, people who've never met, cooperating towards shared, often abstract, goals.
And the difference isn't biology, it's mythical glue.
That's the term they use. Shared belief in the story of the nation, the market, the religion, the law. That's what binds millions of strangers together.
And this isn't just ancient history. The sources stress that our most modern, sophisticated institutions run on exactly the same principle, like corporations.
Oh yeah, the Peugeot example they use is brilliant for illustrating this. It asks, what is Peugeot SA?
Is it the cars, the factories, the workers, the managers, the shareholders?
No. Cars are products, factories are assets, people come and go.
So what's left?
The sources say, imagine a disaster destroys everything physical, all the cars, factories, people. Does Peugeot SA cease to exist?
You'd think so. There's nothing tangible left.
But legally, financially, potentially no. The legal entity, the shared fiction called Peugeot SA, could still exist. It could still hold debt or intellectual property. It could borrow money, hire new people, build new factories, start again, if the story persists.
That's kind of mind-blowing. The company is just an idea we all agree on.
Exactly, a powerful legal fiction.
Yeah.
And modern business people and lawyers, the sources call them powerful sorcerers, telling incredibly complex imaginary stories that shape the real world. Far more complex in some ways than tribal myths.
Because these corporate fictions can coordinate millions globally in daily work, not just hundreds for a festival.
Precisely. Hunter-gatherer myths were strong, maybe good for 500 people trading shells or fighting Neanderthals together. But modern fictions scale cooperation to unbelievable levels.
And the cognitive revolution was what unlocked this potential.
Fundamentally. Before it, behavior changed mostly through slow genetic evolution or big environmental shifts. Afterwards, thanks to flexible language and shared fictions, sapiens could change behavior rapidly and pass it on culturally. New ways of organizing, new beliefs, spreading without waiting for biology.
Can you give an example of this cultural power overriding biology?
The sources point to celibate elites. Think Catholic priests, Buddhist monks, historical Chinese eunuchs.
People who choose not to reproduce.
Right. Which, from a purely Darwinian perspective, makes no sense. It's actively detrimental to passing on your genes.
So why did these institutions persist for centuries?
Not because of a celibacy gene, but because of shared stories, scriptures, doctrines, cultural values that gave meaning and status to these non-reproductive roles. It shows how powerfully culture, built on fiction, can shape behavior, even overriding basic biological drives.
Oh. So we've gone from small bands to potentially millions cooperating through shared stories. This sets the stage for the next huge transformation, the agricultural revolution.
Ah, yes, the shift to farming. And the sources present this as, well, deeply controversial. Was it really progress? Or did it make life worse for the average person?
They seem to lean towards the latter sometimes, calling it maybe history's biggest fraud.
They do emphasize the downsides for many individuals. Harder, more repetitive labor, often a less varied and nutritious diet compared to foragers, and the explosion of infectious diseases that came with dense, settled populations and living close to livestock.
But whether it was good or bad for individual happiness, it was irreversible, right?
Absolutely. Once populations boomed thanks to farming, you just couldn't go back. There wasn't enough wild food to support that many people. The die was cast.
And the population numbers are staggering, from maybe 5 to 8 million foragers globally around 10,000 BCE.
To about 250 million farmers by the 1st century CE. A colossal demographic shift.
Though farming wasn't the only way people settled down early on.
Good point. The sources mention those potentially very early permanent fishing villages, maybe 45,000 years ago in Indonesia, possibly linked to the sea voyages to Australia. Stable marine resources allowed settlement without farming.
And we keep coming back to Göbekli Tepe, hunter-gatherers building monuments before farming.
Right, reinforcing that idea that large-scale cooperation fueled by shared beliefs wasn't solely a product of agriculture forcing people together. The capacity was there earlier, driven by culture, by myth.
So these revolutions changed how we lived. Let's talk about how we organize ourselves within these new, larger societies. The idea of imagined social orders.
This is such a key concept. Why are societies structured differently? Why do rules change? The sources contrast two famous examples. Hammurabi's Code from Babylon.
Which explicitly says people are unequal. Nobles, commoners, slaves, different laws, different penalties.
Right. And then the U.S. Declaration of Independence proclaiming all men are created equal.
Polar opposites in principle.
Exactly. But the core argument is that both are imagined realities. Both systems are based on foundational principles, hierarchy in one case, equality in the other. But these principles, the sources argue, aren't objective truths found in nature. They exist only in our collective imagination, in the stories we tell ourselves.
And they use biology to challenge the idea of natural equality specifically.
They do. Biologically speaking, evolution works on difference, not sameness. We all have different genes, different environments leading to different traits and abilities. The idea that everyone is inherently equal is hard to ground in pure biology.
So where does that idea come from?
The sources trace the Western concept of equality largely to the Christian theological idea of the soul, that God created every person with a soul, and all souls are equal in his eyes. Take away that specific belief, and justifying inherent equality becomes, well, more challenging from a purely objective standpoint, according to this view.
So things like social hierarchies, discrimination, these are presented as constructed orders built on these invented principles.
That's the core idea. Take wealth inequality. Systems allowing inheritance, where wealth passes down generations, might seem natural to us or historically even divinely ordained. But it's based on a chosen principle within an imagined order.
And racial discrimination.
A powerful, tragic example. The sources discuss post-Civil War U.S., where beliefs in black inferiority were widespread and deeply ingrained, presented as scientific fact by some, but fundamentally rooted in social myth, not biology.
They also bring up Nazi racial theories.
Yeah, a chilling example of constructing a hierarchy based on a warped interpretation of biology. The Nazis admired human potential, but believed, based on their reading of Darwin, that humanity needed improving through selective breeding and eliminating inferior groups. They saw things like liberal humanism, which protected the weak, as unnatural. That propaganda poster comparing an Aryan and a mixed-race person visually captures their fear and their constructed hierarchy. It's terrifying how powerful these imagined orders can be, even when later completely debunked by science, like genetics did after 1945.
And gender inequality is viewed similarly. Biological differences exist, obviously, but most roles are cultural constructs.
Right. Childbirth is biological. But who can be a merchant, who can vote, who leads armies? The sources argue these are overwhelmingly cultural. They use the ancient versus modern Athens example.
Ancient Athenian women couldn't do much outside the home, supposedly due to their biology. Modern Athenian women vote, work, run for office. Biology didn't change. The imagined order did.
Precisely. Or asking why dukes, not duchesses, were typically army officers, wasn't biology. It was constructed gender roles within a specific social hierarchy. While theories about patriarchal genes exist, the sources emphasize culture as the dominant force shaping these roles across history. Hammurabi's Code, again, with its different penalties based on gender and status, shows how baked in these constructions were.
Okay, so imagine order structure societies. Let's scale up again. What unified vast regions? Money and empires.
Money. Back to shared fictions. One of the most successful fictions ever. It started with things like barley, which had actual use value.
But was awkward to carry around and store.
Exactly. Heavy, perishable. Shifting to something like silver shekels was a game changer. Silver itself isn't that useful intrinsically, but it's durable, portable, divisible. The whole system relies on trust.
Trust that everyone else will accept this shiny metal for goods and services.
Bingo. And this trust, this shared belief, spread incredibly far. From Lydian coins in Turkey to Chinese systems using copper, silver, gold.
And crucially, this trust crossed cultural lines.
That's the magic. People with different gods, different rulers, different languages, they could all trust gold and silver. This created, the sources argue, a single economic zone across Afroasia, paving the way for eventual global economic and political integration. Money was the first truly universal belief system.
Powerful stuff. And then empires. How did the sources define them? It's not just about size or how they started.
No, the key definition they use has two parts: cultural diversity, ruling over multiple distinct peoples, and flexible borders, having the potential or tendency to expand.
So a large, ethnically uniform nation wouldn't technically be an empire by this definition, even if it was big.
Correct. It's the combination of ruling diverse peoples and having expandable borders. And this definition helps explain why empires were so central to history. They were massive melting pots, forcibly or gradually blending peoples, cultures, economies, ecosystems under one roof, pushing towards a single interconnected human society.
And the sources push back against common negative views of empires, don't they? Not saying they were good, but challenging simplistic assumptions.
Right. Two main points. First, the idea they're inherently unstable. Historically, for 2,500 years, empires were often the most stable form of large-scale political organization. They usually fell due to external invasion or internal elite conflicts, not mass uprisings of conquered peoples who, over centuries, often assimilated.
And second, the idea they are always purely evil and exploitative.
Again, while acknowledging the brutality of the Colosseum, built on conquest and forced labor, the sources argue there's more to it. Empire builders often needed legitimacy, and one way was to spread a common culture.
And they often believed they were genuinely improving things.
Often, yes. They genuinely believed they were bringing benefits: a higher culture, law and order, better infrastructure, philosophy, true religion. The Chinese mandate of heaven implied a duty to civilize. Romans felt they brought peace and justice to barbarians. Islamic caliphs, a divine truth. Spanish and Portuguese, Christian salvation.
Even if it involved immense violence from our perspective.
Exactly. Their perspective was different. And crucially, imperial cultures weren't static. They often absorbed huge amounts from the peoples they conquered. Greco-Roman culture, the Abbasid Caliphate blending Persian, Greek, Arab elements, the Mongols adopting Chinese ways. Even the U.S. is a giant cultural blend. Those tables showing the imperial cycle really illustrate this mixing.
And the ultimate irony
Is that the very values spread by empires like Western ideas of self-determination, human rights, socialism, were later used by colonized peoples to demand independence from those empires. They turned the empire's own ideologies against them. A really fascinating historical twist.
a testament to the unpredictable power of ideas. Okay, from empires to belief systems more broadly, religions.
The sources cover the big shifts: polytheism, belief in many gods. But they note it didn't necessarily exclude a higher power or fate overseeing everything. Think Greek Moira, Norse Wired, Yoruba Olodumare, Hindu Atman. Polytheism could be quite flexible, accommodating local gods alongside bigger ones.
Then monotheism, one God.
And the key distinction here is between local monotheism, like early Judaism, our God for our people, and universal monotheism, like Christianity or Islam. One God for everyone, and we should spread the word.
And the Roman issue with Christians wasn't just the one God part.
Less about theology, more about politics. Romans tolerated lots of gods, but Christians refusing to also honor Roman gods and the divine emperor. That looked like treason, a threat to unity and order. Ironically, the sources note, far fewer Christians were killed by pagan Romans than were later killed by other Christians arguing over doctrine.
Ouch. Then dualism.
Belief in two opposing forces, good and evil. Like Zoroastrianism, it offers a neat solution to the problem of evil. Why does a good God allow suffering? Well, there's a powerful evil force fighting against him. Monotheism has a harder time explaining evil while maintaining God is all good, all-powerful, and all-knowing, often resorting to ideas like free will.
And Buddhism gets significant attention.
Yes, focusing on Gautama's core insight about suffering. It's not caused by pain or misfortune itself, but by craving.
Craving for things to be different than they are.
Exactly. Craving pleasant experiences to last, craving unpleasant ones to stop. Even when you get something good, like finding love, the mind often jumps to fearing its loss or wanting something even better. This constant wanting, this dissatisfaction, is suffering.
So nirvana isn't heaven, it's stopping the wanting.
It's the extinguishing of craving, reaching a state of perfect contentment and serenity because you've broken that cycle of attachment and aversion. You accept reality as it is, internally. That map showing Buddhism's spread highlights how influential this idea became.
A very different approach. And the sources suggest that even if traditional religions fade for some, new religions take their place.
Things like nationalism, capitalism, humanism. They function like religions in providing meaning, values, goals, rituals, often demanding faith. And people mix them. You can be a nationalist, a capitalist, and a humanist.
Let's focus on humanism, especially liberal humanism.
This is huge in the West. It puts humans at the center, believes in a sacred, free, unique individual self or soul. The sources argue this is a direct descendant of Christian belief in the soul.
But what if you take God and the soul out of the equation?
Then it gets tricky, according to the sources.
Yeah.
What makes the individual sapiens so special and sacred, if not a divine spark? And this bumps up against modern science.
How so?
Life sciences, genetics, neuroscience increasingly suggest our actions and feelings aren't driven by a free self, but by biochemical processes, hormones, genes, neural networks, determined much like other animals.
So a gap between our legal political systems based on free will and individual responsibility and what science seems to be telling us about biological determinism.
A growing gap, yes. It raises huge questions about justice, morality, identity. And they contrast this with Nazi humanism, again, a dark version, that embraced a biological view using distorted Darwinism to justify horrific policies based on their idea of improving humanity through selection. That poster is a chilling reminder of where that path led.
This tension leads us right into the scientific revolution.
And the sources frame it in a really interesting way, not just as a revolution of knowledge, but maybe primarily a revolution of ignorance.
Ignorance. How is admitting ignorance revolutionary?
Because pre-modern systems, religious, philosophical, generally claim to already have the important answers found in scriptures or ancient wisdom. Ignorance was a personal flaw you just hadn't learned properly. The idea that the entire system didn't know something fundamental was radical.
But modern science starts by saying, we don't know.
Exactly. It admits collective ignorance. Nobody knows exactly how the Big Bang started, or how consciousness works, or the perfect economic system. Science embraces uncertainty. Theories are temporary, always open to being disproven by new evidence. This willingness to admit ignorance is what drives discovery.
But discovery requires resources. Science isn't free.
Not at all. Labs, equipment, salaries, databases, it's incredibly expensive.
And who pays?
Often, funding decisions aren't purely about curiosity. Politics, economics, religion play huge roles. The sources use the example. Cow udder research gets way more funding than cow psychology. Why?
Because the dairy industry has money and influence.
Precisely. So scientists often have to justify research based on potential practical benefits, commercial, military, medical.
This focus on data and practical application fueled the rise of certain tools.
Mathematics and statistics became absolutely central. There's a great early example from 18th century Scotland. Two ministers needed to set up a life insurance fund for widows.
Webster and Wallace.
Right. They didn't consult scripture. They collected data on death rates and used probability to calculate how much money they'd need. A very modern approach.
And now stats are everywhere in science.
Fundamental. Genetics, economics, physics, psychology. It reflects a shift in education, too, from theology and classics being central to math being foundational.
And the tight link we see today between science and technology, that's relatively recent, too.
Surprisingly recent. For centuries, they were mostly separate fields. Think philosophy versus blacksmithing. Bacon talked about linking them in the 17th century science for power over nature. But it didn't really take off until the 19th century.
What changed?
Mostly rulers and capitalists realizing the military and economic potential. Before that, why fund abstract science? But WWI was a brutal wake-up call. Science delivered terrifying new weapons, planes, gas, tanks.
So investment poured in.
Massively. Science became crucial for national power. That image of the V-2 rocket symbolizes this hope placed in science for technological dominance.
And science started challenging perceived limits, things myths warned against.
Yeah, traditional stories often had warnings. Tower of Babel, Icarus, the Golem, don't overreach, don't play God.
But science pushed back, like Benjamin Franklin and lightning.
Great example. His experiments showed lightning was just electricity, a natural phenomenon, not divine anger. He disarmed the gods with his lightning rod. It demystified the world, showed human ingenuity could understand and even control natural forces. That image of him with the kite is iconic.
A huge contrast to ancient heroes like Gilgamesh, who searched for immortality but ultimately failed and had to accept death.
Modern science doesn't accept those limits so easily. It actively seeks to overcome aging, disease, even death itself. Look at lifespans now compared to the past, like Edward II's mother needing 16 pregnancies for one surviving male heir. Science and tech have already pushed back biological limits dramatically.
And this relentless drive, this focus on overcoming limits and achieving growth, brings us squarely to capitalism.
Identified in the sources as maybe the key engine of the modern world. And the core concept, growth. Constant, relentless growth. The modern economy is portrayed like a hungry organism that needs to keep expanding.
Driven by Adam Smith's revolutionary idea.
That greed is good. Or rather, that individual self-interest, pursuing private profit in a market, paradoxically leads to increased collective wealth. A win-win.
My getting rich helps you.
Because I invest, create jobs, buy your stuff.
Oh.
It turned traditional morality on its head. Being rich went from potentially sinful to being seen as socially useful, even virtuous, because the wealthy drive the engine of production that theoretically benefits everyone.
And this changed how wealth was used.
Big time. Compare a medieval noble spending lavishly on feasts and tournaments versus a modern CEO in a simple suit reinvesting profits to expand the business. The whole mindset shifted towards investment for future gain.
And this wasn't just the super rich.
No, it permeated society. Ordinary people started talking about investments, stocks, bonds, property. Governments started justifying spending on infrastructure or education as investments that would yield future returns.
And this capitalist financing model reshaped empire building.
Hugely. European conquest became less about just the king's treasury or nobles funding expeditions and more about credit, joint stock companies, bankers, and merchants seeking profitable returns.
So empires funded by capitalists eventually outcompeted those funded by kings.
That's the argument. They were simply better at raising the vast sums needed for global ventures. People prefer investing for profit over paying taxes.
The comparison between the Spanish king and Dutch merchants illustrates why.
Yes, the Spanish king defaulted on debts, seized property, bad for investor confidence. Capital flowed instead to places like the Netherlands, where laws protected private property and contracts. Lesson learned, stable laws and property rights attract capital, which fuels power.
And this financial power could translate into political control even without direct conquest initially.
The Egypt example is stark. European banks lend money, Egypt gets into debt, Europeans intervene politically to ensure repayment, and eventually, when Egypt resists, Britain occupies the country. Finance paved the way for imperial control.
But capitalism isn't presented as purely positive. There's a significant dark side acknowledged.
Definitely. The idea of a perfectly free market is called naive. Markets need political frameworks, police, courts to enforce rules, prevent fraud. Think of market crashes like the Mississippi bubble or the 2007 crisis.
Yeah.
Regulation and trust are essential.
And the relentless drive for profit can be ethically blind?
This is maybe the most damning critique. Capitalism, the sources argue, has caused immense suffering and death, not necessarily out of active hatred like some ideologies, but out of cold indifference coupled with greed.
The Atlantic slave trade being the prime example.
Horrifically so. The investors, the shippers, the plantation owners, they weren't necessarily motivated by personal malice towards Africans. They were looking at balance sheets, profits, losses. Human beings became entries in ledgers. The suffering was a monstrous externality of a profit-driven system.
Yet capitalism also offers a kind of promise, doesn't it? A secular salvation.
It's framed that way, a promise of eventual heaven on earth. Just be patient, let the system work, keep growing the pie, and eventually there will be enough for everyone. Poverty and suffering will be eliminated through perpetual economic growth.
And this need for growth fuels modern consumerism.
Absolutely. Capitalism needs people to buy more and more stuff. The contrast between ancient olive oil hand cream and the complex chemical list on modern cosmetics shows the scale of production fueling this.
And society encourages it. Treat yourself.
Yes, consumption becomes a virtue. Saving is almost seen as problematic. That quote from the cereal box calling saving unhealthy is quite something, a total reversal from historical ideals of frugality, like the Puritans or Spartans, where only elites flaunted wealth.
How has this focus on markets and states impacted the individual's place in society?
There's been a huge shift. Historically, people were embedded in families, communities, clans. The state often dealt with the group, not the individual. Think of the Chinese Baoyi system, organizing families for taxes.
But now the state and market deal directly with me, the individual.
Right. You pay individual taxes, you get individual benefits, you have an individual employment contract. This includes recognizing women and children as individuals with their own rights, separate from the family head, able to own property, choose spouses, divorce.
That sounds like liberation. Is there a downside?
The sources suggest yes. While freeing people from potentially oppressive communities, it can also lead to alienation, loneliness. You lose that built-in support network.
Mm.
And the individual standing alone can feel powerless against the huge impersonal forces of the state and the market.
It's a trade-off. Now, despite this potential alienation and the constant news about conflict, the sources make a surprising claim about the modern era.
It's actually unprecedentedly peaceful.
Really, with WWIII, the Cold War, genocides.
The argument is that while those catastrophes were horrific, focusing only on them misses the bigger picture. If you look at the overall likelihood of dying violently across history, it was much higher in most pre-modern societies, tribal warfare, banditry, routine state violence, than it is for most people today.
So statistically, we live in a less violent time.
Considerably so in many parts of the world. The peace is so profound in places like Western Europe, the sources say, that people struggle to even imagine what war would be like.
What are the reasons for this long peace?
Two main factors highlighted. First, the cost of war has skyrocketed, especially with nuclear weapons making major power conflict potentially suicidal. They have jokingly suggest Oppenheimer deserves a peace prize for making war unwinnable at the highest level.
And the second factor?
Global economic interdependence. War disrupts trade networks, which are now more profitable than conquest for most developed nations. The sources note South America achieved regional peace decades before Europe, partly because the economic incentives shifted earlier. It's remarkable, though fragile, achievement.
So we've covered immense ground, which leads to maybe the deepest question the sources raise. With all these changes, are people actually happier?
Yeah, historians rarely ask this, but it's fundamental. So many ideologies promise happiness, nationalism, communism, capitalism. But are their assumptions about what makes people happy actually correct?
How can we even measure happiness historically?
It's incredibly difficult. Modern approaches use subjective well-being surveys, basically, asking people how happy they feel. Then researchers look for correlations.
Like, does more money make you happier? Does democracy? Marriage?
The results are complex. Wealth seems to boost happiness up to a point where basic needs are met, then its effect diminishes. Freedom and strong social bonds, like marriage, tend to correlate positively with reported happiness. But there's also the issue of expectations.
Meaning?
Unhappiness in the developing world today might stem less from absolute poverty and more from relative poverty. Seeing first-world lifestyles on TV raises expectations and fuels dissatisfaction, even if material conditions are better than in the distant past. Comparing yourself to others matters.
And biology plays a role too, our internal chemistry.
The sources discuss the biological perspective. Our brains seem wired to maintain a relatively stable happiness level. Evolution favored transient pleasure and pain and motivates survival actions, not constant bliss. We get a temporary high from achieving something, then settle back to a baseline, always slightly wanting more to keep us striving.
Which sounds a bit like the Buddhist idea of craving causing suffering.
There's a parallel. Though the Buddhist solution isn't chasing the next high, but extinguishing the craving itself. Interestingly, the sources contrast this with the Western New Age idea, happiness starts within, which aligns with the biological focus on internal states, but often aims to generate positive feelings, rather than transcend craving like Buddhism suggests. That Harlow monkey experiment showing the need for comfort over just food also hints at deeper psychological needs science is only beginning to fully grasp.
So this whole incredible journey from hunter-gatherers shaped by natural selection through cognitive leaps, imagined orders, empires, science, capitalism, it brings us back to biology, but with a twist.
Right. For almost all our history, we were bound by biological limits. Natural selection shaped us.
But now,
Here's the really big, maybe unsettling idea. The scientific revolution might be the most important biological revolution since life began, because it might allow sapiens to break free from natural selection itself through intelligent design.
not the religious concept, but us actively designing life.
Exactly. Using our intelligence and technology to reshape biology according to our will, not leaving it to chance, mutation, and environmental pressures.
Example.
Technology, genetic engineering. We're not just breeding animals anymore, we're editing genes directly. The Alba bunny, the rabbit engineered to glow using a jellyfish gene, is presented as a simple but profound example. Life governed by human design.
Resurrecting extinct species, like mammoths using ancient DNA.
Another example of potentially overriding natural processes like extinction through intelligent intervention.
And applying this to ourselves, brain interfaces.
Technologies allowing people with locked-in syndrome to communicate using brain signals are just the beginning. Could this lead to reading minds, merging consciousness with AI? The possibilities are staggering and potentially terrifying. Understanding psychological needs, like in the monkey experiment, could also lead to manipulating them.
It fundamentally changes what it means to be Homo sapiens. We might be on the verge of becoming something else entirely.
Which leads to the conclusion. We're standing at this incredible threshold. We've built complex societies on shared stories, achieved immense power through science and technology, created unprecedented wealth and relative peace.
But we're also grappling with ancient anxieties, facing the consequences of our growth, questioning the foundations of our own belief systems, and holding technologies that could lead to, well, almost anything.
The sources suggest we're poised between potentials that resemble both heaven and hell. History hasn't decided our fate yet. Chance still plays a role. Understanding how we got here, the power of myths, the drivers of change, the deep questions about happiness and suffering is presented as vital if we want to navigate what comes next.
So to wrap up this massive deep dive, we went from sapiens' rapid rise, explored hunter-gatherer life, saw the power of shared fictions unleash cooperation through the cognitive revolution, leading to imagined orders, empires, money, religions, the scientific revolution's embrace of ignorance, capitalism's engine of growth, and finally, the potential to transcend our very biology.
It's an incredible arc, showing how intimately linked our stories, our social structures, our technologies, and our very being are.
And reflecting on all this, the sources really emphasize the power of those shared fictions. They built empires, they run global corporations. Our current systems, capitalism, science, they operate on their own core assumptions, their own stories about what's good or true. We've seen our biological limits and now the potential to overcome them technologically.
It leaves you with a lot to think about.
It really does. So the final thought to leave you with is this. Given how powerfully these shared stories, these imagined orders, and now our technological capabilities shape our reality, how does all this influence your life, your sense of happiness, your understanding of the world, and what you see as the future for us as a species? Definitely something to mull over until our next deep dive.